It's a sunny day. You're going to visit your mother in the nursing home. You stop to pick up a plant for her room and have brought some of her favorite snacks. When you walk into her room, she doesn't seem happy to see you. She sits, looking out her window, deep in thought. When you show her what you brought for her, she gives a thank you kind of smile, but it quickly fades to a solemn expression. She doesn't sort through her goodies or put anything away. She doesn't even acknowledge the succulent you brought her. An aide appears in the door, and you notice that your mother becomes submissive and fearful. These actions and expressions are typical of elders that have been abused in some way. One of the telltale signs of elder abuse is a change in behavior. According to the National Council on Aging, about 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 60 have experienced abuse in some form. It is estimated that only 1 in 14 cases is actually reported. Elder abuse is defined by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention as an intentional act or failure to act by a caregiver or another person in a relationship involving an expectation of trust that causes or creates harm to an older adult. An older adult is a person over the age of 60 years old. There are 5 major forms of abuse: physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental emotional abuse, financial abuse, and neglect. Today we will discuss the forms of abuse and go over some examples of each. Our discussion will surround our loved ones in the long-term care setting. It is important that we recognize the types of abuse for the protection of our elders. There will come a time when we become responsible for our parents, maybe even grandparents, and aunts and uncles, depending on the family dynamic. We must be informed on the types of abuse and how to report it should we suspect that our loved ones are being abused. The first form of abuse we will discuss is physical abuse. Physical abuse is force that is intentional and results in injury, pain, illness, disability, and/or death. Examples of this include slapping, punching, biting, pinching, suffocation, pushing, grabbing, and shoving. This is the easiest form to see. Bruising, reddened areas, pain, sores, and abrasions are some physical evidence of abuse. Long-term care facilities investigate all these injuries and do incident reports to explain how they occurred. This is a way of screening for abuse and providing an explanation should families be concerned about an injury. The next form of abuse is sexual. Sexual abuse, defined by the CDC, is forced or unwanted sexual interaction of any kind with an elder adult. This can be both touching and non-touching acts, including sexual penetration, oral contact, and harassment. This also applies to patients that are not able to give consent. Sexual abuse can also be done using technology. If sexual pictures of an elder are taken without consent, it is considered abuse. It is also a dignity issue, which treads upon their resident right of dignity. Emotional and mental abuse is harder to detect as there is not really any physical evidence. Mental emotional abuse is verbal or nonverbal behavior that results in mental anguish, fear, or distress. This form of abuse can be name-calling, discrimination, humiliation, and threatening, as well as social isolation and control. Next, we will discuss neglect. This is the most common form of elder abuse. The definition of neglect on the CDC's webpage is the failure by a caregiver or responsible person to protect an elder from harm or the failure to meet needs for essential medical care, nutrition, hydration, hygiene, clothing, and basic activities of daily living or shelter, which results in a serious risk of compromised health and safety. Neglect can be both intentional and unintentional. Examples of neglect include providing inadequate shelter, food, and health care. Neglect can result in physical injury and illness, including sepsis, pressure ulcers, and fall-related injury. An example of unintentional neglect is a caregiver forgetting that a patient is on the bedpan. These are common areas where a pressure-related injury can occur. Pressure injuries are typically indicators of neglect. When caregivers fail to turn and reposition patients, a pressure injury may occur. This is a graphic showing some of the statistics of falls. This is important for night shift workers especially. They must be sure to check on patients frequently. Receiving medical attention in the first hour or the golden hour can make all the difference. These patients are lined up in the hallway. This is very typical in a long-term care facility. They look as though they are waiting for assistance and have been for a while, or just understimulated. Notice that there is no caregiver in the image. The last form of abuse we will discuss is financial abuse and exploitation. The elderly population is very financially vulnerable. Financial abuse is the unauthorized or misuse of an elderly person's resources by a caregiver or other responsible party for the benefit of someone other than the elderly individual. This can include unauthorized spending, selling of the individual's belongings, or denying access to or information about their financial resources. This can also include misuse of guardianship or power of attorney. Financial exploitation by the facility can be found in being charged for products and services that are not received, or intentional upcoding. Upcoding is when caregivers and facilities document a patient as needing more assistance than they actually need. This in turn bills the patient more if they are private pay, or bills Medicaid more if they are responsible for paying for the patient's care. Financial abuse can also take form in theft. To prevent this, an inventory sheet of patient belongings and money kept on the patient is done. Could you imagine your mother's wedding ring and engagement rings went missing? If someone she and yourself trusted to take care of her stole them? Let's say this woman is in a limited assistance facility and she's starting with the early signs of Alzheimer's. The nurse brings in some papers and asks her to sign them, saying that they are consent papers for care, or something of the sort. The patient, trusting the healthcare professional, signs the paper and hands them back with a smile. It turns out that the woman just made the nurse a beneficiary to her life insurance without knowing it. Long-term care facilities must follow through on any missing items of the patient and provide documentation. This is why the inventory of belongings sheet is important. Some belongings may be very valuable. Now that we have discussed the different forms of elder abuse, we need to know how to report suspected or witnessed abuse. If the abuse is currently taking place or has been witnessed, or if the elder is in immediate danger, 911 should be called, or the local authorities. You can also contact the Adult Protective Services hotline at 1-844-697-3505, available Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. If your loved one is in long-term care facility, you can contact your regional ombudsman. The ombudsman for Clinton County and Essex County, as listed on the New York State website, is Amy Gehrig. She can be reached at 518-562-1732. Abuse of an elder is a felony offense punishable by New York State law. As I stated earlier, only 1 in 14 cases are reported. Abuse does happen. We need to be aware and informed so we can approach the situation properly. Knowing the forms of abuse allows us to be able to prevent it from happening and able to recognize it when it does. If we report any suspicions that we have that our elders are being abused, the facility can investigate and prevent abuse from occurring again or with other patients. We need to speak up about elder abuse. We need to be aware.